Hello and welcome to this LinkedIn Live interview. My name is Alessandro Faya. I'm a communications officer at EMA's Media and Public Relations team. Today we will talk about the Accelerating Clinical Trials in the EU initiative, or ACT-EU. Clinical trials are the gold standard for generating evidence on medicines. They are the cornerstone for the approval of safe and effective medicines in the European Union. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by two very knowledgeable guests on this topic. So first, I will start with introducing Marianne Lunzer. Welcome, Marianne.
Thank you.
Marianne is a medical doctor by training. She works in the clinical trials department at the Austrian Agency for Health and Food Safety, and she is also the chair of the Clinical Trials Coordination and Facilitation Group of the HMA, the CTFG. Our second guest today is Peter Arlett. Welcome, Peter.
Hi, Alice.
Peter Arlett is the head of the Data Analytics and Methods Task Force at EMA. He is also a medical doctor by training. He held various leadership roles here at EMA, previously also at the European Commission at the British National Regulatory Agency. So before we start the first introductory chat where we introduce the topic with our guests, just want to remind you that you can also, we want to hear from you, so you can post your questions in the comments section, and we will address your questions in the second part of this live chat. So my first question will go to Peter. It's been 2 years since the launch of ACT-EU. Can you walk us through the issues that ACT-EU was created to address for the clinical research environment in Europe?
Sure. Maybe I can start by explaining what ACT-EU is. So ACT-EU stands for Accelerating Clinical Trials in the EU, and it's a collaboration between the heads of the national agencies in the member states, the European Commission and the EMA to reinvigorate clinical trials in the EU, to facilitate better, faster and smarter clinical trials in the EU. So I think the first thing to say is that the foundations for clinical trials in Europe are very strong. If you look at all medicines on the world market, many of those medicines were discovered and developed in Europe historically. We have excellent clinical facilities, we have excellent research and laboratory facilities in Europe, and an expert workforce to run clinical trials. However, over the last 10 years or so, we haven't seen the growth in clinical trials that some other regions have seen. And if we look to see what the cause of this lack of growth in clinical trials is, well, it's multi-layered, but at least part of it is about complexity, and part of it is about a need for better collaboration between clinical trial sponsors, so those conducting clinical trials, as well as the regulators and the ethics bodies. We're convinced that if we can have a multi-stakeholder approach to resolving issues about the clinical trials environment in Europe, we can deliver greater growth in clinical trials, and through more clinical trials, through better clinical trials, we can have better evidence on medicines, which should equate to better health.
Thank you, Peter. And linking this to the last part of his response, he talked about the involvement of stakeholders. So ACT-EU, we know that ACT-EU brings together all the relevant players in this space. Can you give us an insight on who sits at the table and what goes on and what are the discussions going on at the moment in ACT-EU?
Sure. As Peter already mentioned, the parties involved are the HMA, EMA, and the European Commission. So experts from all those institutions collaborate on the activities that are envisioned for delivering a better landscape for Europe for clinical trials. We are working on different activities that are defined in a work plan. This is a work plan until 2026 by now. And different activities that I would like to highlight is innovative clinical trial designs, support for non-commercial sponsors, good clinical practice, update of the guidance in respect to good clinical practice, and above all, also the multi-stakeholder platform. And here I would like to share some details. Using the multi-stakeholder platform, we have the opportunity to discuss together with the different stakeholders, which are patients, healthcare representatives, European non-commercial sponsor institutions, and also European commercial sponsor institutions. And by doing so, we have the opportunity to incorporate the insights of the different stakeholders in our activities. And in order to do so, there are different tools available. So we have events, we can have consultations, we have reference groups. So we are trying to bring together the different stakeholders in order to take informed decisions on how to improve the landscape.
And maybe an obvious question here would be, are you already seeing some results? Can you give us some numbers, in terms of clinical trials that are authorized in Europe?
Yeah, I can elaborate a bit on the numbers that we have seen so far. We perhaps, as an additional information, there is an active screening and an active we actively follow up the activities in the landscape, and we are using KPI in order to do so, and we are publishing numbers on a monthly basis on the active website. And just to refer back to numbers that we have already published, numbers from end of May. By then we have roughly seen 3,400 new initial applications, not speaking about transition applications where we are moving the directive trials to the clinical trial information system, and authorizations of roughly 2,200 trials. When we speak about attractiveness and about the situation in Europe, and Peter has done so already, to interpret those numbers might be a bit difficult now in the light of COVID-19 pandemic, and as I said already, about all the activities in relation to transitioning the trials from the directive to the clinical trials regulation. I think all parties involved are rather busy with those additional activities and tasks, and therefore I think it's too early to make conclusions.
Can I just maybe add to that, because you mentioned transition trials, and I think there's quite a lot of interest in transition trials. We've estimated that there are perhaps 4,000 clinical trials originally authorised under the directive, the Clinical Trials Directive, that will need to be transitioned to the Clinical Trials Regulation by January. I think it's fair to say we're about halfway down that journey. So about half the clinical trials have now been submitted for transition, but there's quite a lot more work to be done, isn't there?
This refers to
that
the
deadline.
transition to CTIS, which is the Clinical Trials
Correct.
Information System, which is the single entry point for clinical trials in the EU. So anything you want to add on this transition that I'm sure maybe many viewers are familiar with?
Yeah, if I may, I would really like to use the opportunity to say it is really important that all sponsors are aware that all clinical trials that are expected to go beyond the 30th of January 2025 take the active decision to transition their trials to CTIS in time. Sponsors need to be aware that also there is some time needed to approve those applications, which might take up to 3 months. We have an agreement amongst member states to accelerate those applications. But if there are peaks, or if the member states are short in resources, the active acceleration might be a difficult point. So to be on the safe side, those 3 months should be taken into account when it comes to the decision when to transition their trials. There is a lot of training material. There are many training events to support sponsors to successfully undergo this transitional step. We have simplified the procedures substantially. You can find detailed guidance on the Commission website, on the CTCG website, and also the EMA has published more technical support when it comes to how to fulfill the duties in CTIS. And perhaps there is also a good occasion to point to a future event, and this is planned for the 18th of September, where sponsors can get practical advice on how to transition their trial just in time for mid-October, when we hopefully receive the last transition applications.
Thank you, Marianne. I will have a couple more questions before we start addressing the questions that we received in the comment section. So for you, Peter, I will ask you, how will ACT-EU achieve its goals, and what is your message to stakeholders who are probably watching this live or watching a rerun of this live on our LinkedIn channel? How can they get involved and contribute?
Yeah, so thanks. I think the first thing I want to say is that there's been a lot of work within the European regulatory network, so the national agencies, the Commission and EMA, to put in place this initiative called Accelerating Clinical Trials in the EU, ACT-EU. So governance being put in place, project structure for each of the 11 priority areas where we're trying to deliver change, as well as establishing the multi-stakeholder platform, which is a really important, I would say, central element to these efforts in terms of ensuring that stakeholders' priorities and needs are driving our work. We believe that these efforts are starting to bear fruit. So just a few very quick examples. We've established the multi-stakeholder platform, and we are aligning our priorities with stakeholders, so we know their needs, we know their wishes. We have established some scientific advice pilots so that we're trying to maximize the chances of of clinical trials being successful, if you like, through giving good advice and aligning the advice on the design of the clinical trials with the more regulatory aspects. We have put in place much more and better information on clinical trials, how to make clinical trial applications, how to design clinical trials, and through better information, we believe we're empowering stakeholders and clinical trial sponsors to get it right. We're putting in place training to ensure that we have experts within the network, but also experts in the clinical trial community. We're putting in place also guidance, particularly guidance focusing on new and innovative methods like decentralized approaches, like platform trials and so on. And through guidance, we're maximizing the chances again of clinical trials being successful. In this way, we believe that, and particularly working in a multi-stakeholder way, we believe that we can deliver an increase in growth in clinical trials in the EU. We can deliver better, faster and smarter clinical trials. And through better, faster and smarter clinical trials, we'll get better evidence on medicines, better health, better healthcare delivery. So you asked, a second part of your question was about how stakeholders can get involved. I think the first point of reference would be the ACT-EU website, which has got lots and lots of information on the initiative, but also signposts to other information about clinical trials and the regulatory environment. We hold a lot of public workshops, which are always broadcast, and also people can actively participate. We hold training webinars, we have consultations and surveys, and in this way I would invite all stakeholders to engage. We want to hear diverse views and we want to hear from diverse stakeholders, and collaboratively we believe we can accelerate clinical trials in the EU.
Thank you, Peter. Marianne, perhaps a deep dive into one of the factors that was mentioned by Peter in his answer. So how is ACT-EU also contributing to scientific advice, to having better, probably more coordinated scientific advice in the EU?
Thank you. I think that's a very important deliverable as well. As sponsors were actively asking for advice as one additional communication tool, if we may. They were used in the past to direct conversation with the different member states and also the ethics committees. And the advantage of having channeled the submissions to one unique portal was perceived as depriving them a bit from this direct conversation. And the advice formats that are offered now have two different focus areas. And preclinical trial application advice, which is a concept that is delivered by a clinical trial coordination group together with the member states who are really doing the procedures, but coordination is done by CTCG. The stakeholders can reach out to us and can ask their questions before they are submitting their clinical trial application in order to solve complexities, or perceived complexities, and also giving us the chance to align our views on topics that might not ever have been discussed before. This format is only focusing on regulatory and technical advice, while the second pilot we are talking about is really a scientific advice, where the views of the scientific advice working party and the views of the member states, again coordinated by CTCG, are brought together in order to avoid misalignments and to bring together the perspective of the clinical trial authorization aspects and the design aspects that are supporting the marketing authorization applications later on. So it should bring together the early vision of performing clinical trials, and the later expectation that is that the sponsors are, or the marketing authorization applicants are confronted with when they are applying for the marketing authorization later on.
Thank you, Marianne. I think it's time to go to the questions that we have received. So the first one is, we kind of addressed it already, but maybe could be useful to once again talk about, because these questions come from Annie Lennon, and she's asking, the first question is, what are the main challenges that the EU needs to address to accelerate clinical trials? I think we already answered, but maybe do we want to reiterate again why? What are the main points on the agenda, let's say, for ACT-EU?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the symptom is a lack of growth in clinical trials. When you start talking to stakeholders, and we've put a lot of effort over the last 2 years to talk to stakeholders to understand their challenges, it's multifactorial. So it may be regulatory issues, it might be funding issues, it might be logistics issues of getting a clinical trial started, it might be contractual issues. So there are many, many different layers. ACT-EU is trying to be a platform to understand all of those challenges. And then in terms of actions, we're particularly focusing on the regulatory aspects where we have the ability to execute change. But I don't know if there's anything you would want to highlight beyond that, Marianne.
No, I think you said it very well. Perhaps just to mention that change management is always a challenge, and I think we are undergoing a huge change management process for all stakeholders. It involves huge changes on the sponsor side, where the timelines are shorter, and also on the member state side, where the coordination effort is increasing, and which still has to be needs to fit into the human resource capacities the member states have.
And can I complement that? Because we do need to understand that it's a major change from the Clinical Trials Directive to the Clinical Trials Regulation, and acknowledging that change, as Marianne just has, is really important. We're also, as a network, doing a lot to support that change in terms of training, stakeholder engagement and communications. We do believe that the rewards, once we get through the effort of change, will be significant, particularly for multinational clinical trials, where one application can lead to authorization in up to all of the member states in Europe, but also in terms of the transparency with the public portal for the clinical trials information system. So for the clinical trials regulation, giving very early access to significant information about authorized trials, which is a huge advantage, for example, for patients with unmet medical needs, trying to identify a clinical trial near them.
If I can, Peter, before we take another question from the audience, can you elaborate a bit more about the transparency and the information that is now accessible in via CTIS?
So yes, the clinical trials regulation requires very high levels of transparency. We have just revised the transparency rules to implement those legal principles, and we've just launched a new public portal with those new transparency rules, in fact, only a month ago. What the revision of the transparency rules did was they tried to deliver better for stakeholders. Particularly, we spoke to patient groups, and what patient groups told us is they want much faster information about authorized clinical trials so that they can identify a clinical trial for them, potentially to enroll and get treatment. What sponsors also told us, so those executing clinical trials, said that the transparency provisions previously were quite burdensome. It put quite a lot of administrative burden on them. So we've tried to strike a balance between high levels of transparency, but also protecting commercially confidential information. And we think we've struck that that balance correctly. So the new public portal has already made about 4,400 clinical trials public. So these are authorized clinical trials, enabling patients to be able to identify a trial near them, potentially, if it exists. Because of the rates of clinical trials being approved through the system, we'll have hundreds more clinical trials being added to that portal every month. We're also working to enhance the usability, the searchability of that site, and there's going to be new features as early as September to make it easier for patients to find clinical trials. So we're quite excited that we have delivered and we struck the right balance, particularly delivered for patients in terms of accessing clinical trials.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. So going back to the questions, another question from Annie Lannon. She's asking, clinicians have very little time to engage in clinical research. How does ACT-EU plan on better integrating clinical research within the European health system? I think maybe Marianne, you want to...
I can start at least. As already mentioned before, we also have the healthcare professionals represented in the ACT-EU multi-stakeholder platform. So we are listening, and I think we also need to listen carefully. We've already mentioned it, the COVID-19 pandemic has left clinicians with a huge work burden. There is also a matter of human resources in the healthcare system. So I think the main first part here is to listen and to understand how we can improve their situation, and then taking actions. But this needs to be informed by a good discussion.
It's quite interesting because the question highlights a challenge, but it also highlights one of the great advantages of the European clinical trials environment, and that is that most clinical trials are embedded in the delivery of healthcare, which is good for patients. It means you're not getting your routine care from one clinical clinician and then a clinical trial intervention from another clinic, for example. That's one of the great strengths of Europe, and it's a strength we need to build on, I believe. But, as Marianne said, we need to acknowledge the huge pressures that the healthcare systems in Europe have gone through at the moment. And in the dialogue with stakeholders, we should identify certain points where we might be able to help, perhaps through training, perhaps through streamlining procedures for the regulatory side of clinical trials.
Thank you. So questions keep coming in. One more question from Oana Tatu. She works at the Contract Research Organization. Could you let us know what are the plans for facilitating the submission and review of complex clinical trials via CTIS?
I'll tell you what, how about if I just explain what CTIS is, and then Marianne, maybe you could talk about complex clinical trials in particular. So I would imagine most people following this broadcast will be familiar, but maybe not everyone. So CTIS, the Clinical Trial Information System, is the information system that supports the operation of the clinical trials regulation. It's a single portal of entry for applications for clinical trials, for the assessment of those applications, and then for the granting and authorization for the clinical trial, and then the supervision, the oversight of a clinical trial as it progresses. It also incorporates this public portal that allows patients, healthcare professionals, the general public to search for authorised clinical trials and therefore have better information about clinical trials and potentially be able to enrol in clinical trials. I think, so maybe then if you go on to the complex clinical trials and how CTIS is handling them.
I can try to describe a bit the shortcomings that might be alluded to in the question or as part of the question. In CTIS, you have to take a decision when it comes to complex clinical trials about which approach you take when you submit it. You can either have everything under one single clinical trial number, which has certain downsides associated, or you submit your complex clinical trials with all arms, so to say, allocated to an individual clinical trial number. And I think the question refers to the complexity to navigate those options. And I think there is already guidance existing. And we also specifically received all applications that we have received so far for the pre-CTA advice were in relation to complex clinical trials. So obviously there is
there is a need.
There is a need for better information, and it might also inform us to understand if there is any future IT development that might be required. Currently, I think we can do without.
And maybe overseeing the questions that are coming in for advice is a good way of judging where we need to focus guidance in the future, and maybe training events. So watch this space.
Yes, it's a way to take the temperature, let's say.
Exactly, and understand the problems facing sponsors.
All right, the following question comes from Eleonora Sarracco. She's a clinical research assistant. Considering the increasingly stringent regulatory requirements that raise the costs of conducting clinical trials, what actions is EMA planning to take to help non-commercial sponsors afford these expenses, particularly for trials involving small populations, and given the long-term nature of clinical trials? Peter, maybe you want to...
I can have a go. So I think the first thing is to acknowledge the challenge, particularly for small populations, for non-commercial sponsors. Cost and administrative burden is a really important challenge. I think it's at the core of what ACT-EU is trying to do by bringing together the member states, the European Commission and the EMA. So the three regulatory bodies, if I can put it like that, with responsibility for clinical trial authorization and oversight in the EU, is it gives us an opportunity to look to support non-commercial research and also an opportunity to streamline going forward. And I'm sure there will be opportunities to streamline the regulation and the requirements placed on non-commercial sponsors. There are active discussions currently with the multi-stakeholder platform, and we're having a big meeting in October of the multi-stakeholder platform where the non-commercial sponsors will be talking about their needs and will be identifying specific actions that can be taken to support them. The multi-stakeholder platform advisory group is actually chaired by a leader from the non-commercial sector, so that means we're very focused on trying to help and trying to streamline.
So perhaps if I may add,
yeah, sure.
We could point to an achievement from ACT-EU, and if you go to the ACT-EU website, you can see the landscape for support for non-commercial sponsors in Europe. So for each individual member state, you can see the supporting activities in those specific member states.
And maybe this is a good time also to remind our viewers that we will post some useful links in the comments section, and they will be available even after this live has ended. So there are a lot of resources that you can consult for more information on ACT-EU. The next question comes from Darius Zebrowski from the Stop Duchenne Association. Could you please discuss the issue of equal participation of patients from different EU countries in clinical trials? In other words, what should be done to make participation in clinical trials taking place in various EU countries available to all EU citizens, regardless of their country of residence?
So this is a wonderful...
cross-border trial. This is not at the core of ACT-EU activities at the moment, because there is an ongoing activity that is industry driven, but still it has been sleeping in a way for a while due to COVID again. But there has been an event late last year, if I remember well, where the different stakeholders were already brought together, and where I think we had a very fruitful discussion about how to open up for cross-border trials, specifically when it comes to small numbers of patients in a specific field, which might not necessarily be an argument for not opening different trial sites in different areas. But when it comes to difficult interventions, for example, it might be reserved for centers of excellence. And by acknowledging this fact that specific trial sites might be better suited for specific interventions or even specific trials, I think the conclusion is automatically that we might need to be less conservative when it comes to cross-border trials. And there was a number of needs and clarification needs and relaxations and contacts to be built in order to allow this. But this is dealt with at the moment, and more activities will follow. But I'm aware that the budget and the time of the project is limited, so perhaps we will have to.
Can I give a compliment? See it from a slightly different angle. I mean, rare diseases are often, well, by definition, you won't have many patients in each country, and to do impactful clinical trials that give results upon which give evidentiary impactful evidence, we should aim for multinational clinical trials. And at the absolute core of the clinical trials regulation, but also of ACT-EU, is supporting multinational clinical trials through one single portal, CTIS, but also through all of the efforts of ACT-EU in bringing people together. It's our number one goal, I would say, is to support a greater number of multinational rather than single member state trials. So I think the question is at the core of our mission, actually, and we will be doing an awful lot over the coming years to support it in technical terms and regulatory terms, but possibly also in terms of networking and bringing people together.
Okay, so we still have quite a few questions to go through. Manisha Lakani wants to know which one of the 11 elements for accelerating clinical trials in the EU do you believe is the most important one, and how do you ensure success? So we'll have to, I guess you will have to pick.
Do you want one? You pick one, I pick one.
Go ahead. Which is your favorite?
You go first. What's your favorite? Most important, I think, was the question.
The most important.
Let's say your favorite.
My favorite. Which child is your favorite child? That's a very difficult one. I think an important activity is the one in relation to public health emergencies, because we might learn a lot about our system when we take a look at preparing for crisis, and perhaps that's the most interesting one.
And maybe I would put my vote on multi-stakeholder interaction. So there's this priority action to establish a multi-stakeholder platform, which we've done, but now for the years to come, we operate that multi-stakeholder platform to ensure that we're listening to stakeholders' needs, stakeholders' wishes, and that we remain really focused on delivery for stakeholders. And stakeholders might be patients, healthcare professionals, clinical trial sponsors, etc.
Okay, next question from Daniela Gavrila, Senior Regulatory Officer at a CRO. Are there any shortened timelines foreseen for the review of phase 4 and low interventional trials? And I believe Marianne maybe.
Yeah, currently not. And this goes a bit into the technical direction again. Basically, all clinical trial applications come into CTIS and are in a pool of clinical trial applications where a standard timeline is allocated to each individual trial, and then or to trial application, and then out of a large number of clinical, and we heard already 4,000 authorized or over 4,000 authorized clinical trials, picking actively different clinical trials adds complexity to the system and increases the work burden for the individual assessors, and also creates complexity when it comes to organizing the ethics committee meetings and so on. So everything that is accelerated needs active planning and replanning, and thereby creates a lot of additional burden. So I would rather expect accelerated assessments purely driven by urgency and need instead of reduced assessment effort, so to say.
Just to complement, obviously a success factor is getting the application right when you put it in. So very high quality applications that follow the guidance and the rules are likely to go through the system quicker. They're likely to get less questions during the assessment process. So we would strongly support that clinical trial sponsors, particularly sponsors that are not doing it every week, if you like, just doing it periodically, get trained, look at the guidance. If they have the questions, put them through this pilot on pre-CTA application advice, etc. And that itself means that the application will be high quality, will go through the system.
Higher chance of
success. With less questions, with less problems.
Yeah, perhaps ideally with no questions, because then you save the timeline for the question round.
Yeah.
Okay, the following question comes from Lissy de Ridder, president of the Dutch Society of Pediatrics. Performance of clinical trials in the pediatric field are essential to improve medical care and future perspectives of children with all kinds of diseases. This is so challenging for many reasons that this is rarely done. What action is undertaken to address this challenge?
For pediatric trials.
Pediatric trials.
We have a project from CTCG together with EMA and together with the PDCO, where we have initiated the conversation. We've already had a kickoff meeting about a closer collaboration, and I think we will have a very good idea of how to improve the situation for pediatric trials. We've heard a lot about PIPs being mandating clinical trials, and then the clinical trials not being authorized due to scientific, ethical, or whatever reasons. And in order to improve the situation and in order to align our views across the institutions, we are sitting together and we are having the conversation in order to improve the situation.
Maybe to complement, many of the diseases being investigated in children are rare diseases. So the question that came from the Duchenne representative earlier is relevant here. Multinational clinical trials, which is core to what we're trying to promote, will bring in larger patient numbers, give more impactful results. So we are very, very much focused on delivering for rare diseases and rare diseases in children.
Okay, Thomas Metcalf from Healthcare System Partnerships is asking, does the EMA think it's also important that the EU remains globally competitive in terms of share of clinical trials? Recent data show that the EU's global share of clinical trials has dropped since 2019. Well, I think we...
Yeah, so we addressed that, but maybe just to re-emphasize the point, a very healthy clinical trials and clinical research environment is good for patients. It's good for getting new medicines to market. It's also good for getting good evidence to optimize our use of medicines on the market. So the European Regulatory Network is very focused on supporting growth in clinical trials. There was a nuance in the question that I just want to pick up on. The overall number of clinical trials in the EU is broadly flat. What we haven't seen is the growth that some other regions have seen. And yes, I think as regulators, we want to see that growth. We want to see that growth for innovation and for public health.
All right. Now we have a question from Barbara Brenner from FAGE, Germany. If a clinical trial is already ongoing somewhere, wouldn't it be unethical to allow a second and third trial on the same topic? I don't know, Marianne.
Good ethics question,
Yeah.
Marianne.
We are both not ethics, but obviously perhaps this goes back to the transparency in the system and accessibility of data, which makes it easier now than ever before to really review what is already going on. And perhaps the question for the ethics committee is easier to answer now than before, with all the information at hand.
Thank you. Okay, and then I think our last question from Dylan Aken, Research Assistant at the Cancer Research UK National Biomarker Centre. What are your plans for the near future for digitizing the clinical trials?
Interesting. Do you want to have a go first? The use of.
I'll leave you the floor.
Okay. Well, let's again, we can approach that from different angles. So, as regulators, we need to be open to technological change. We need to be open to the best way to capture reliable data and data that's relevant to the clinical endpoints. So there's already been some guidance on decentralized clinical trials, which implicitly is about embraces remote data collection. We understand that the modernization of good clinical practice, which is being finalized through ICH at the moment, but then the implementation and the training will go on at a regional level, and it's going to be a major focus for ACT-EU going forward, needs to embrace things like consent, things like digital data collection, and of course then putting that into a package for regulatory submission. So I think it's very much central to what we're doing. Maybe just one other thing that it reminds me of, and we haven't spoken about it yet during this interview, and that's data about clinical trials beyond just searching for an individual clinical trial in the CTIS portal. We have a whole work package on improving public health and improving clinical research based on knowledge and based on data. And we had a really good workshop at the end of January on this. And what stakeholders told us is that they want to be able to analyze data across clinical trials to understand what's clinical trial designs are successful, what clinical trial designs and results lead to a successful marketing authorization application, etc. So in that sense, using digitalization, using data to support decision making is also central to what we're trying to do.
Okay, Marianne, you want to complement or we're fine? We have another question that just came in from Lenka Sochorova. I hope I didn't butcher that surname. How can we deal with different time points when the approval is obtained for part 1 and part 2 of the clinical trial, and one part needs essential document updates based on requests for information, but the second part is already approved?
What a lovely question, Marianne Linzer, to end on.
Yeah. Yeah, perhaps this gives me the opportunity to touch a bit on Collaborate, which is a CTCG initiative supported by ACT-EU. It is anchored to ACT-EU. So the support is project management support, basically, where we have gathered a few, or perhaps I should not say only a few, where we have gathered the problems that we as a collective of regulators and stakeholders together in the current system, and where we are trying to find solutions for the different problems. And this one is really something that is difficult to tackle by anything else than a technical change. It is linked to how the regulation is written. The regulation is directly mirrored in CTIS, so therefore CTIS is just fulfilling the legal obligations in a way, and still it creates a problem. So I think in the simplification task force we have already received a letter from the Collaborate activities to the simplification task force. This is might be the number one.
I agree.
Priority.
So the questioner is touching on something that we know is a high priority for simplification, and I think it's fair to say we're on the case.
So watch this space. I think this was the last question, which then leads me to wrapping up this live. I want to thank Peter and Marianne for your time and for your willingness to respond to the questions from our viewers. I want to remind our viewers that you can find the links with the useful resources in the comments section. It will be also useful for us if you want to suggest topics for new lives. This live will be available, so the recording will be available on our LinkedIn channel. Please also feel free to share it with your contacts. So that's all from us. Thanks a lot, and have a nice rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.